Hey everybody, welcome back to the clinicaltrialsguru.com. Again, it's the clinicaltrialsguru.com. It's been a long day here at the office, but I'm getting back to some of you guys' questions. And today's question that I'm going to do a video on comes from a relatively new coordinator. So the question, I'll just read it to you. It says, my question involves the necessary/prudent actions that a hospital should take when purchasing a privately owned practice that has its own clinical trials. So what do we do as far as IRBs, SOPs, and what should the acquired practice do to make this smooth transition? So obviously I'm going to assume that the private practice that also does research and the hospital, which also does research, now they're going to be under one ownership of the hospital. So unfortunately, the private clinic that probably has been accustomed to using central IRBs will have to switch to local IRBs, and they're going to learn that it's a lot harder and a lot more paperwork and it takes a lot more time to get study startups, protocol approved, informed consent approved, all those kind of things. As far as SOPs, their SOPs are probably going to have to be revised. In fact, you're probably going to have the hospital's SOPs be the SOPs in place at the new site that you've just acquired, right? You should use the same SOPs. If you have any virtual workspace, I prefer Intralinks VIA. I use it for my infrastructure. It would make things a lot easier as far as paperwork and collaborating. But definitely the SOPs will have to be revised. Now, if the hospital that just acquired the private site, and I'm assuming it's an off-site location, so it's not in the hospital, maybe it's like in a separate building that's not affiliated with the hospital at all, maybe there's a way for that new site to not have to be under the jurisdiction of the hospital, although I doubt it, because since the hospital now owns it, I'm sure that their IRB is going to have jurisdiction over research. So you're basically merging the two sites. I would assume the reason this was done was because for the hospital you can do the inpatient studies, and for the other private practice you can do the outpatient studies. So it sounds like unfortunately you're going to have to use a local IRB. Smooth transition, you're going to have one or two people that go back and forth. They're kind of like the liaisons between the two sites. You're going to have site director, probably from the hospital, spend a couple months, if not an entire year, at the outpatient clinic to make sure there's a smooth transition. And let's face it, it's not going to be smooth, especially if that research site was accustomed to using central IRBs. And if their SOPs are probably much different than what your SOPs are, so I'm hoping that the cultures don't clash too much, because that often happens during acquisitions. But if it's a small enough company and there's not that many employees there, you should experience a little less resistance when it comes to having them adapt to the hospital's way of doing things. That's what I would do. You're probably going to have, you can centralize certain functions now. You're going to be able to centralize business development. You're going to be able to centralize quality assurance. You're just going to have the QA people travel from one site to the other. You could probably centralize regulatory, startup regulatory. That could all be done by one person or one department. Contracts and budgets, patient recruitment. So there's a lot of synergies here. It can work, but there's also the whole culture clash. And the biggest issue, in my opinion, is the central IRB, switching from central to local IRB. I've never worked with a local IRB in my life. I've always worked at private research clinics. I've always owned private research clinics, so we always use central IRBs. That'd be my biggest concern. But try to find a way, and I don't know whether you're from the hospital or whether you're from the site, not that it matters. Try to find a way to leverage the hospital's strengths. So they probably have departments that are probably more compartmentalized than the smaller private practice was. So try to leverage that. Try to leverage some of their infrastructure, leverage their patient database, leverage some of their physicians. I think you can now get a bunch more sub-investigators to work with you at your site. And then you will always have a place to do your inpatient studies. because some outpatient trials have inpatient components. So there's a lot of possible synergies. I recommend using a virtual workspace, and I recommend centralizing some of the more common tasks like QA, employee training, HR, human resource, contract and budgets, business development, and then the SOPs have to get integrated as well. Or not integrated, but the hospital SOP will need to be used by the private site. Unless, and I don't think this is possible, but unless the hospital is allowed to have that site that they just purchased operate independently of the hospital because it's not on hospital premises, but I doubt it, right? Thanks for watching. Hope it helps. Let me know how it goes. Dan from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Take care.